there is a version of the American Revolution that most people know. Lexington and Concord, Valley Forge, Yorktown. A scrappy colonial army holding on long enough for the world to take notice. It is a story of soldiers and generals, of frozen ground and improvised muskets, of a young nation willing itself into existence through sheer endurance. But there is another story running underneath that one, and it moves on water. Ships, money, and sea routes shaped the outcome of American independence just as surely as any famous land battle. The guns that fired at Saratoga did not come from colonial forges. The powder that kept continental armies in the field did not materialize from nothing. And the surrender at Yorktown was not made possible by American arms alone. Behind it all, operating first in careful silence and then in open warfare, was one of the largest naval forces on Earth, the French Navy, a hidden engine of revolution that historians have long underestimated and that the popular imagination has almost entirely forgotten. Before we dive in, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of the internet. What this story covers is not a list of battles. It is a connected thread that begins in 1776 with forged invoices and fictitious companies, moves through Atlantic crossings at night, through neutral island harbours thick with rumour, and eventually reaches the sun-hammered waters of the Caribbean, the fog of the Indian Ocean, and a narrow bay on the Virginia coast where everything changed. It ends with a financial catastrophe that France never fully survived, with shipwrecks slowly giving up their secrets in the New Jersey River, and with legends of ghost fleets that sailors still repeat. To understand why this story was hidden at all, you have to understand the world France occupied in 1776. The monarchy wanted the British humbled. They had lost the 7 Years' War barely a decade before, surrendered Canada, surrendered India, and watched their Atlantic empire shrink while British power swelled. The appetite for revenge was real, but the timing was everything. France's finance minister Turgot warned openly that moving too soon would only add to a burden that was already threatening to break the kingdom's finances. The fleet needed more time, the treasury needed more preparation, and so France moved in shadow, funding a front company, routing gunpowder and muskets and cannon through neutral Dutch islands, doing everything a great power can do while officially denying it is doing anything at all. Then, in the summer of 1778, the veil lifted in one of the most startling moments of the entire war. Residents along Narragansett Bay looked out one morning and saw a fleet of warships standing into the harbour. They thought at first the ships were British. They were not. Admiral d'Estaing had arrived, and the French navy was suddenly, undeniably visibly at war. What followed was not a simple story of Allied triumph. D'Estaing's early campaigns were frustrated by weather, miscommunication, and the brutal logic of ocean distances. The war spread in ways almost nobody had planned for, into the Caribbean, where sugar islands changed hands under cannon fire, across to the Indian Ocean, where a French admiral named Suffren fought the British to something close to a draw across multiple engagements spanning continents. The conflict that began on a Massachusetts road became, through French ambition and French ships, a genuinely global war. And then there is the question that sits at the centre of it all. How did a French admiral named Grasse, sailing from the West Indies in the late summer of 1781, manage to arrive at the Chesapeake at precisely the right moment to seal off the British escape route and make Yorktown possible? The answer involves prevailing winds, calculated risks, and a voyage that contemporaries called improbable for good reason. It is one of the great feats of naval navigation in the age of sail, and most people who know Yorktown have never heard the name de Grasse. Underneath all of that history, the diplomacy, the admirals, the global campaigns, lies another layer still, physical and newly recovered. In 2023, divers working in the Mullica River in New Jersey documented 4 18th century schooner wrecks, vessels provisionally linked to French-connected privateering and to a forgotten battle at Chestnut Neck in 1778. Those wrecks have rested in the river mud for nearly 250 years. The artefacts coming up from them are a reminder that this war left wreckage far beyond the famous sites, on coastlines that history overlooked, in waters that kept their secrets long after the last veteran died. And then there are the ghost fleets, the legends that clung to de Grasse's ships long after the battle was done, stories born from French sailors' superstitions and carried into the 19th century, persistent enough that they say something real about how France processed a victory that cost it more than it ever fully reckoned. That cost, measured in lives and eventually in blood, is where this story ultimately leads. But to understand why France paid that price, you have to go back to the beginning, to the moment when the watching from the shadows first began. The shadows began in Paris, in the long aftermath of a humiliation that the French court had never stopped turning over. The 7 Years' War ended in 1763 with the Treaty of Paris, and the terms were devastating. France surrendered Canada. It surrendered its foothold in India. It watched Britain consolidate a maritime empire that stretched across 3 oceans, while French diplomats signed away what 2 generations of colonial effort had built. The wound was strategic, financial, and deeply personal to the men at Versailles, and the lesson they drew from it was not that empire was a losing venture, it was that they needed a better navy. The scale of what had to be done was almost impossible to contemplate quietly. At the war's end, France possessed roughly 47 ships of the line. Britain fielded more than twice that number. The Duc de Choiseul, the minister who took charge of the rebuilding effort, set a goal of 80 ships of the line, enough to challenge British dominance without being obviously suicidal. His 1765 reforms went beyond simply ordering new hulls. He overhauled the dockyards, codified naval regulations into a coherent system, and drove a dramatic expansion of raw material stockpiles. Mass production alone jumped from under 1,600 units to more than 4,000 in the space of 3 years. It was the kind of institutional transformation that rarely makes it into popular histories, but it is the foundation on which everything that followed was built. By January of 1775, the Navy had grown to 60 ships of the line. Progress, but still short of Choiseul's target, and many of those vessels needed significant repair before they could be trusted at sea in a genuine fleet action. The admirals knew it, the finance ministers knew it, and when news of Lexington and Concord crossed the Atlantic that same year, the question at Versailles was not whether to exploit the American rebellion, it was whether the Navy could survive the attempt if Britain chose to strike back hard. Foreign Minister Vergennes was the man who had to hold those competing pressures in balance. He understood what the rebellion represented strategically, a colonial revolt that tied down British regulars, drained British gold and potentially shattered British Atlantic prestige was almost exactly the revenge scenario that French planners had been sketching since 1763. The opportunity was real, but Vergennes was also a realist. He watched the early months of the American war with the careful attention of a man who's been burned before and intends not to be burned again. Were the colonists serious? Could they actually hold a field against British regulars? Was this a genuine revolutionary movement or an expensive distraction that would collapse before France had committed itself too deeply? Inside the court, the debate never fully resolved into a clean consensus. Public opinion in Paris leaned toward open support. The philosophes were fascinated by the American cause, and popular sympathy was not nothing, even in an absolute monarchy. But the men responsible for the treasury told a different story. Turgot, whose job was to hold France's finances together, warned that a war waged too soon would accelerate fiscal pressures that were already dangerous. The navy was rebuilding, but rebuilding costs money, and France was not yet in a position to absorb the full weight of a major maritime conflict with Britain without serious risk to the kingdom's stability. Vergennes navigated this tension with a patience that must have frustrated the hawks around him. He funneled cautious optimism into delay, delay into preparation, and preparation into the quiet authorization of covert assistance, while publicly maintaining neutrality. His own timeline shows the calculation in it. It was not until July 1777, more than 2 years after shots were fired at Concord, that he finally committed to a position of full support for the American cause, declaring internally that France would either back the rebellion properly or abandon it entirely. That moment in 1777 was the pivot, but before it arrived, France had already been doing rather a lot for a nation that officially wanted nothing to do with the war. The mechanism for that contradiction had a name, and it was almost entirely fictional, a trading company that existed mainly on paper, run by a playwright who was considerably more than he appeared. The playwright's name was Pierre-Augustin Caron de Beaumarchais, and if you know him at all, you probably know him from the stage. He wrote The Barber of Seville and The Marriage of Figaro, comedies so sharp and so alive that they were still being turned into operas long after his death. But in the years before those plays made him immortal, Beaumarchais was doing something considerably more dangerous than writing dialogue. He was running guns. In 1776, Vergennes needed someone who could move quickly, think in multiple directions at once, and maintain a plausible distance from the French crown if things went badly. He needed someone who understood commerce well enough to fake it convincingly, who had the personal energy to manage a logistics operation across an ocean, and who would not lose his nerve when the pressure came. Beaumarchais improbably was exactly that person. He had already been working as a secret agent for the Crown on unrelated matters, navigating European courts with the ease of a man who understood that the gap between public posture and private reality was where most real business got done. Vergennes brought him in, explained the objective, and set him loose. What emerged was Rodrigo Tales et Compagnie, spelled slightly differently in different documents, which was itself a kind of operational security. On paper, it was a trading house. In practice, it was a state-sponsored conduit for arms, powder, clothing, and money, flowing to the Continental cause at a moment when the rebellion desperately needed all of those things. The French crown, and critically the Spanish crown, contributed funding to keep the company capitalized, but at no point were their names attached to anything. The fiction of a private commercial firm provided both governments with what they needed most: deniability. If the British discovered the operation and demanded an explanation, Versailles could point to Hortelez as a private concern beyond their control. Whether anyone would believe that was a separate question, but the legal and diplomatic architecture had to be in place regardless. In August of 1776, Beaumarchais wrote to the Continental Congress under the company's name, laying out what he was prepared to deliver. The letter was remarkable in its specificity. He described approximately 200 brass 4-pound cannons, 20,000 pounds of gunpowder, 20,000 fusils, mortars, bombs, cannonballs, bayonets, and clothing, sufficient to equip 30,000 troops, along with lead for musket balls and money already waiting in his coffers. These were not vague promises. He was describing a cache of material already being assembled, already being moved toward ports where it could be loaded and sailed west across the Atlantic. The scale of the commitment made before any formal alliance, before any public acknowledgement, before the Continental Army had proven it could survive a serious campaign, was extraordinary. The logistics of actually moving these supplies required careful routing. France and Spain could not simply load warships with American munitions and sail them to Philadelphia. Every step of the chain had to preserve the fiction of commercial activity. The neutral Dutch island of Saint Eustatius in the Caribbean became one of the key transfer points, a place where material could be offloaded from vessels that had left European ports, held briefly, and then passed to American ships or crews operating under different flags. The island was already a hub of Caribbean trade, which made unusual cargo movements less conspicuous. Goods arrived, goods departed. The ledgers showed commerce, not conspiracy. To move the heavier shipments, Beaumarchais needed vessels capable of crossing the Atlantic with significant cargo, armed enough to discourage interception, but not so obviously military that they announced their purpose from a distance. In April of 1777, he purchased a captured 50-gun French ship of the line called the Hippopotame, renamed her the Fier Rodrigue, and pressed her into service as the flagship of his covert fleet, nominally an armed merchantman, functionally a warship carrying the rebellion's lifeline. The Fier Rodrigue was only one vessel in a larger picture, but she represents the ambition of the operation in miniature. A serious ship, seriously committed, doing serious work under a commercial mask. The diplomatic risk of all this was never far from anyone's mind. French officials were explicit in their warnings. Discovery of the network would give Britain exactly the pretext it needed to treat French support as an act of war before France was ready for that confrontation. American agents receiving the material were specifically instructed not to pay for the goods, not because the goods were free, but because a paper trail connecting French funds to American military supplies was the kind of evidence that could unravel everything. The operational security was imperfect, as it always is with human networks under pressure, and British intelligence was not blind. But through a combination of cautious handling and the natural ambiguity of commercial shipping records, the core of the pipeline held together long enough to matter. And it did matter. The Continental Army in the winter of 1776 and into 1777 was surviving on thinner margins than the histories sometimes convey. Gunpowder was a persistent crisis. Muskets wore out and could not easily be replaced. Uniforms were a practical necessity that the continental supply system struggled to provide consistently. The influx of material from Hortales and Beaumarchais' network did not solve every problem, but it addressed critical shortages at a critical time. Regiments that might have gone into battle with degraded equipment instead went in with French muskets and French-supplied powder. Officers who might have lost men to exposure instead drew on French cloth and French boots. The argument that runs through serious histories of this period is that the covert supply pipeline, more than almost anything else that happened before the formal alliance, kept the rebellion viable long enough to produce Saratoga. In October of 1777, the Continental Army under Horatio Gates forced the surrender of a British force under General Burgoyne at a small town in New York, an event that reverberated through every European court simultaneously. It demonstrated that American forces could not only resist but defeat a substantial British army in the field. And when that news reached Versailles, Vergennes had the proof he'd been waiting for since 1775. The rebellion was not a momentary disruption. It was a war, and the Americans were capable of winning it with the right support. None of that calculation, none of that moment, arrives without the crates of muskets and the barrels of powder that Beaumarchais had been moving across the Atlantic for the better part of 2 years. The playwright-turned arms dealer had done his job. The front company had held its cover. The ships had made their crossings without triggering the diplomatic catastrophe that Paris feared most. There was, of course, a cost, not just strategic or financial, but personal. Beaumarchais would spend years afterward in complicated disputes about repayment for what he had spent and organised, the French government conveniently forgetting the specific terms under which the operation had been authorised. The machinery of covert action tends to work that way. The people who run it are useful until they are inconvenient, and then the ledgers get complicated. But in the late winter of 1777, standing somewhere between his theatre and his counting house, Beaumarchais had managed something genuinely difficult. He had kept an ocean crossing invisible. He had dressed a state operation in the clothes of commerce, and the clothes had held long enough for history to shift direction beneath them. The paper trail that Beaumarchais left behind was deliberately thin, but the physical evidence of what he had set in motion was harder to conceal. Ships have hulls, and hulls displace water, and harbour masters have eyes. Along the Atlantic seaboard of France, and in the crooked anchorages of the Caribbean, a quiet mobilization was taking shape in the years before France declared itself openly, visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at, and deeply inconvenient for anyone who preferred not to see it. The rhythm of it was almost mundane in its repetition. A vessel departs Lorient in the early morning, her manifest listing dried goods, wine casks, bolts of fabric. She clears the harbour watch, catches the Atlantic wind southwest of Brest, and settles into the long crossing. Somewhere in her hold, below the documented cargo, are 50-pound barrels of powder. Sometimes the powder is all that is below decks. Sometimes the bolts of fabric are real, because the best cover is partial truth, and French cloth really was needed in American camps, so the manifest is not entirely false, only carefully incomplete. The captain carries 2 sets of documents. One he will show to any British patrol vessel that comes alongside. The other tells him where he is actually going and what he is actually carrying. The island that made this system work, More than any single warehouse or port in France or America was St. Eustatius. A small volcanic outcropping in the northeastern Caribbean, St. Eustatius had been Dutch for more than a century and operated under a neutrality that made it, by the mid-1770s, the busiest single harbour in the Western Atlantic relative to its size. Merchants of every nationality crowded its waterfront. Goods moved through it without the scrutiny that governed ports under active belligerent authority. By some estimates, roughly half of all the American military supplies that crossed the ocean before the formal alliance passed through St. Eustatius at some point in their journey, offloaded from European vessels, held briefly in warehouses that smelled of salt and gunpowder, then redocumented and loaded onto American schooners or neutral-flagged ships for the final leg north. In November of 1776, the American brig Andrew Doria sailed into St. Eustatius flying the Continental colours. She was officially carrying general merchandise. Her actual cargo included gunpowder and a copy of the Declaration of Independence, recently printed and still sharp-edged in its language. The Dutch fort on the island returned her salute, the first formal acknowledgement by any foreign government of an American vessel flying American colours, and then trade proceeded as it always had, in the blurred space between war and commerce where most of the revolution's logistics actually lived. Beaumarchais' network and the St. Eustatius connection were two threads of the same web. French agents routed material through the island specifically because Dutch neutrality provided a documentary buffer. Powder that had left a French royal arsenal was, by the time it reached an American ship off St. Eustatius, the product of a Dutch commercial transaction. The paperwork said so. The paperwork had been written for exactly that purpose. The British were not fooled, but they were constrained. International law in the 18th century provided limited grounds for seizing neutral shipping without triggering a separate diplomatic crisis, and Britain already had enough diplomatic problems without adding the Dutch to the list prematurely. So the Royal Navy watched, and British intelligence accumulated reports, and the ambassador in Paris sent letters to London describing French port activity, in terms that grew progressively less diplomatic as the months passed. The cutter Revenge, purchased in Dunkirk ostensibly by a private English buyer, was so transparently a French-sponsored vessel operating for American interests that the British ambassador filed a formal protest. The fiction of the sale had been enough, barely, to create the necessary ambiguity, but London knew what it was looking at. What London could not easily do was prove it in a form that justified open war before the British military was positioned to fight one. Into this atmosphere of barely maintained pretense came a figure who made no particular effort to stay invisible. Gustavus Conyngham was an Irish-born American captain who operated out of Dunkirk under French licence, and his approach to the covert war was considerably less subtle than Beaumarchais. In 1778, Conyngham and his crew captured roughly 60 British vessels in a sustained privateering campaign that the London press called piracy and the French government officially disavowed while quietly celebrating. 33 of those ships were burned at sea, 27 were sent as prizes to ports where their cargo could be sold, and the proceeds folded back into the logistics of the war. Prize money from British merchant vessels helped fund the purchase of more powder, more arms, more supplies moving west. The British called Conyngham the Dunkirk pirate. The French called him someone else's problem whenever asked directly. This was the texture of the hidden war at sea. Not grand fleet engagements, but the endless friction of departure and arrival, manifests rewritten in harbour offices, captains receiving new papers at midnight, cargo shifted between vessels in anchorages that appeared, officially, to be handling routine trade. The suspense of it was not the explosive kind. It was the sustained, grinding tension of people maintaining a complicated lie under observation, knowing that a single, careless document or a too honest harbour official could unravel years of careful construction. The British response, when it finally came in force, was Admiral George Bridges Rodney's seizure of St. Eustatius in February of 1781. Rodney called the island a nest of vipers, and his anger was specific and earned. He understood precisely how much material had moved through it, precisely how much that material had sustained American resistance, and precisely how the island's neutrality had been used as a legal shield for what was, in every practical sense, an act of sustained support for Britain's enemies. He seized the island, its warehouses, and the merchant vessels in its harbour, describing the haul with the satisfaction of a man who had finally gotten his hands on evidence he'd known existed for years. What Rodney could not undo was the 5 years of powder, rifles and money that had already made the crossing. The irony that serious historians have noted is that Rodney's seizure came too late to prevent the catastrophe it was meant to address, and may have contributed to it. His fleet lingered at St. Eustatius, processing captured goods and prize claims for weeks, time that might have been used to intercept French naval movements in the Caribbean that were already shaping the campaign that would end at Yorktown. The nest of vipers was closed, but the vipers had largely already departed. What the covert period accomplished in aggregate was not just the delivery of specific supplies, it was the rehearsal of an entire system of agents, routes, false papers, port contacts and transfer protocols that could be converted when the alliance was finally declared into the logistical backbone of open naval warfare. The merchants who had moved powder under false manifests knew the Atlantic crossing. The harbour officials who had looked the other way knew how to clear French vessels quickly. The privateers who had taken British prizes knew the approaches to American inlets and rivers. When France finally stepped into the open in 1778, it did not step into the unknown. It stepped into infrastructure it had been quietly building for 2 years, funded in part by British prize money and sustained by the creative fiction of neutrality, in a war that had never really been neutral at all. The news from Saratoga arrived in Paris in early December of 1777, carried across the Atlantic by fast dispatch vessel, and received at Versailles with a kind of careful attention that French ministers had been trained to apply to information that might change everything. General Burgoyne had surrendered his entire army to American forces on October 17th. More than 6,000 British regulars had laid down their weapons in upstate New York. It was not a skirmish, not a reversal at the edges of a campaign still fundamentally intact. It was a collapse, and it told the French court something it had been cautiously uncertain about for 2 years. The Americans could actually win. For months, French ministers had been watching the covert support network operate. The powder shipments, the Caribbean transfers, the carefully worded manifests that fooled no one who mattered, and asking themselves the question that every government asks before committing to an open war: is this cause worth what it will cost us? The hidden support had been a calculated investment, sustainable as long as the Americans kept fighting, and manageable as long as Britain could not prove French complicity beyond diplomatic protest. But the deeper question, the one that actually governed French strategic thinking, was whether the Americans could last long enough to do Britain the kind of damage France needed them to do. Saratoga answered that question with 10,000 prisoners and a broken British campaign plan. Within weeks of the news reaching Versailles, France abandoned its ongoing conversations with the Dutch about potential joint action and began moving directly. Negotiations with American representatives, Benjamin Franklin prominent among them, operating with characteristic patience and precision from his residence in Passy, accelerated into something more concrete than the polite exchanges of the previous months. On February 6, 1778, the Treaty of Alliance was signed. The document committed France and the United States to mutual defence and stipulated that neither would make peace with Britain without the other's consent. It was a remarkable commitment for a monarchy to make to a republic that had been in formal existence for less than 2 years, and it reflected not sentiment, but calculation. The calculation that Britain's Atlantic empire, weakened and distracted, was now genuinely vulnerable. The treaty did not immediately mean war, it meant the end of the fiction. France notified Britain of the alliance on March 13, 1778. Britain, which had known for years what French ports were doing and had absorbed years of diplomatic protests and carefully worded denials, responded in the only way available to it. 4 days later, Britain declared war. The transition from the previous section to this one, from hidden to open, happened with a speed that the infrastructure of the covert years had made possible. The agents, routes, and port contacts that had moved powder under false manifests now moved under French naval colours. The harbour officials who had processed quietly irregular cargo for 2 years now processed warships. The Atlantic crossing that American and French captains had made in the shadow of plausible deniability was now made in the shadow of cannon. The system that Beaumarchais and his network had rehearsed did not need to be rebuilt. It needed only to be scaled. The first major naval demonstration of what that scale meant came off Ushant, the rocky island at the westernmost point of Brittany, in July of 1778. 2 fleets, French and British, roughly 30 ships of the line each, met in open Atlantic water and fought the battle that formally announced France's return to great power naval competition. The Battle of Ushant was tactically inconclusive, the kind of engagement where both sides could claim something, and neither could claim everything. But its strategic significance was not in its outcome, it was in its occurrence. The largest French fleet assembled since the 7 Years' War had put to sea, engaged the Royal Navy on something approaching equal terms, and returned to port. The covert war had ended, the fleet war had begun, and fleet war once started does not confine itself conveniently to a single ocean. This was the reality that French naval planners now had to confront with the full weight of strategic responsibility. The Atlantic was one theatre, the Caribbean was another, and in some ways more immediately urgent, because the Caribbean was where the economic spine of Britain's empire lived. Sugar islands like Barbados and Jamaica supplied roughly 1/5 of all British imports by value, a figure that put them, collectively, worth several times what the American colonies had been worth in tobacco. French pressure on those islands was not simply a military inconvenience for London. It was an attack on the financial architecture of the empire itself, disrupting Caribbean trade, threatening British island possessions, forcing the Royal Navy to split its attention between the North American coast and the West Indies. This was how France could do to Britain what a colonial rebellion on land alone never could. The stakes, then, were not simply whether the Americans would win their independence. They were larger and older than that. France had never fully accepted the settlement of the 7 Years' War, which had stripped it of Canada, large portions of the Caribbean, and influence in India. The American War was an opportunity to contest that settlement, to use the rebellion as a lever against the empire that had humiliated France in 1763. What had begun as an insurgency in Massachusetts was now, because of February's treaty and March's declaration, a world war. British admirals who had gone to sleep thinking about Boston Harbour woke up having to think about Martinique, about Gibraltar, about the Indian Ocean, about supply lines stretching across hemispheres. French entry did not simply add another belligerent to an existing conflict. It changed the nature of the conflict entirely. For the Americans, this transformation carried implications that were not all comfortable. Their rebellion, which they had understood as a matter of principle and sovereignty, was now also a piece in a European imperial contest that they had not designed and could not fully control. France's interests and America's interests overlapped significantly in the short term. Both wanted British military power diminished, British armies driven from the continent, British naval dominance challenged. But France was also fighting for Caribbean islands that it intended to keep, for trade routes it intended to dominate, for a restored position in a global imperial competition that had nothing to do with the rights of colonists. The alliance was genuine, and it was also transactional, and the men on both sides who understood statecraft understood that clearly. What neither side could yet see in the spring and summer of 1778 was how the combination of French naval power and American land forces would eventually converge into something that resolved the war in a single, improbable season. That convergence was years away, dependent on decisions not yet made, voyages not yet undertaken, and a French admiral not yet positioned for the crossing that would finally close the trap. For now, there were fleets to organise, islands to threaten, and a global war to fight. One that had emerged from the shadows of the covert years with astonishing speed, carrying the weight of 2 empires and the aspirations of a new nation all at once, across waters that were now, unmistakably, contested. Into that contested Atlantic sailed the first emissary of France's new open commitment, a fleet large enough to matter, and a commander whose ambitions matched the occasion. The Comte d'Estaing departed Toulon on the 13th of April 1778 with 12 ships of the line and 4 frigates, carrying roughly 4,000 French troops in addition to his naval crews. By any measure, this was a serious force. It was the kind of force that, arriving in North American waters, could tip the balance of a war that had been grinding inconclusively for 3 years. And that, precisely, was the expectation that d'Estaing carried with him across the Atlantic, an expectation built into his orders, shared by American commanders waiting anxiously on shore, and freighted with all the optimism of a newly declared alliance that had not yet been tested. D'Estaing himself was a figure of considerable complexity. He had made his name not in naval service but as a land officer, rising through the French army before transitioning to the navy, an unusual trajectory that made him, depending on whom one asked, either a versatile commander capable of thinking across service boundaries, or a man whose instincts were fundamentally those of a soldier given ships to manage. He was energetic, politically well-connected, genuinely committed to the American cause at a personal level that went beyond the purely strategic. He had obtained his commission through influence as well as merit, and the combination made him at once capable and volatile. A commander who could inspire confidence and then shatter it within the same campaign. The American commanders waiting for him understood almost none of this. What they understood was that a French fleet was coming, and that a French fleet, properly coordinated with American land forces, could do what American arms alone had not managed: close off a major British-held port, cut off reinforcement and supply by sea, and force a surrender that would change the strategic map. The target, agreed between d'Estaing and the Continental Command, was Newport, Rhode Island, a substantial British garrison holding a strategically valuable harbour. The plan was straightforward in conception. The French fleet would blockade Newport from the water, while American forces under General John Sullivan tightened the siege from land. Combined pressure from sea and shore would make the British position untenable. It was the kind of plan that looks elegant when written on paper and begins to fracture almost immediately upon contact with reality. The first indication came not from the enemy, but from geography. d'Estaing's fleet arrived off New York in early July and found Admiral Howe's smaller British squadron sheltering behind Sandy Hook. The French blockaded them, sitting off the New Jersey coast from the 11th to the 22nd of July, but could not force the issue into the harbour itself. The largest French ships of the line drew too much water to clear the sandbar at the harbour's mouth. The depth soundings were taken, retaken, consulted, debated. The bar would not yield to optimism. d'Estaing, with the firepower to potentially destroy Howe's squadron or seize New York entirely, found himself held at distance by accumulated sand rather than British cannon. It was the first lesson of the American campaign. The Atlantic coast was not the Mediterranean, and its waters were governed by shoals, tides, and hydrography that French charts, drawn from limited surveys, did not fully capture. He moved north toward Newport, arriving off Rhode Island in late July to find that the land half of the combined operation was not ready. George Washington had written to General Sullivan on the 17th of July, ordering him to raise 5,000 men for the joint assault. The letter did not reach Sullivan until the 23rd, and even once it arrived, Sullivan could initially field only around 1,600 troops, a fraction of the force the plan required. The fleet sat offshore, visible from the British fortifications it was meant to overwhelm, while the land component scrambled to assemble itself from scattered militia and continental regiments spread across the countryside. The coordination problem was not a failure of intention. It was a structural condition of a war being fought across a continent with no telegraph, no telephone, no mechanism faster than a horse rider for transmitting orders between commanders who might be separated by days of travel. Every plan that depended on simultaneous action was in practice a plan that depended on luck. The French and American forces converged slowly through late July and into August, accumulating towards something that still looked like it might work. Sullivan's numbers grew. d'Estaing's fleet manoeuvred. The British garrison on Aquidneck Island remained bottled up, its seaward flank sealed by French warships. Then, on the 10th of August, the weather arrived. A violent storm swept in from the Atlantic, building across 2 days into something that neither fleet could operate through. The French and British ships that had been manoeuvring for position off Point Judith found themselves suddenly fighting, not each other, but the sea itself. Waves that dwarfed the normal Atlantic swell drove ships onto new headings they had not chosen. Rigging came down. Hulls worked in heavy swells in ways that opened seams and started leaks. D'Estaing's flagship, the Languedoc, an 80-gun ship of the line, one of the most powerful warships in the French Navy, lost her masts and her rudder. She was left wallowing, barely steerable, in the aftermath of the gale. Other ships in the fleet were damaged to varying degrees. The British fleet, no less battered, struggled back toward New York. The planned Franco-American assault on Newport simply ceased to exist. There was no longer a coherent combined force capable of executing it. D'Estaing made the decision that any flag officer with a crippled flagship and a fleet in need of extensive repair would have made. He withdrew to Boston. The letter he sent to Sullivan explaining this decision was received by the American commander, with a fury that crackled through the official correspondence and spilled into the wider army. Continental officers who had waited for the French fleet as a deliverance found themselves instead watching it sail north without a battle won. Sullivan's protests reached D'Estaing, D'Estaing's replies reached Sullivan, and the diplomatic fallout between Allied commanders demonstrated something important about the nature of coalition warfare: that partners who share strategic goals do not necessarily share the same tolerance for risk, the same understanding of a given operation's priorities, or the same definition of an acceptable reason to withdraw. D'Estaing sailed for the West Indies from Boston, leaving behind an American command whose faith in French naval partnership had been tested and bruised. The Newport operation had not been destroyed by British action. It had been defeated by a sandbar off New York, a letter that arrived 6 days late, a militia muster that fell thousands short, and a 2-day storm that broke the flagship of the most powerful fleet France had ever sent to American waters. None of these obstacles were insurmountable individually. Together they exposed a truth about combined operations that would take years and painful experience to properly address. Coordination between allies is not simply a matter of shared intention. It requires synchronized communications, compatible logistical systems, agreed command hierarchies, and a degree of mutual understanding about how each partner makes decisions under pressure. In 1778, none of these things were in place between France and America in any reliable form. What the Newport campaign left behind more than anything was a lesson. The alliance was real, the French fleet was powerful, and the strategic potential of combined Franco-American action was genuine. But translating potential into outcome required something more than proximity and goodwill. It required the kind of precision, in timing, in logistics, in strategic alignment, that D'Estaing's first campaign had conspicuously lacked. The war was young enough, and the stakes high enough, that there would be time to learn it, but that learning would come at a cost, measured in missed opportunities and campaigns that dissolved before the crucial engagement. The storms off Point Judith were not the last such storms, they were the first instruction. What the Newport campaign had clarified, above all else, was that France had not entered this war merely to settle an argument off the American coastline. D'Estaing's withdrawal to the West Indies was not a retreat from the conflict, it was a reorientation toward a larger one. Because when France formally committed to war against Britain in 1778, it did not sign on to a single theatre, it signed on to a global reckoning, one that would be fought across the full reach of empire, from the sugar islands of the Caribbean to the contested coasts of southern India, from the Atlantic convoy routes to the fortified harbours of the Mediterranean. The American Revolution, as Britain now faced it, was no longer a colonial insurrection. It was the opening movement of a worldwide contest for maritime supremacy. Understanding this changes the entire shape of the story. The British Empire of the 1770s was built on sea lanes. Its wealth flowed from sugar, cotton, and spice, from Caribbean plantations, from the East India Company's trading posts along the Coromandel coast, from the transatlantic commerce that connected London to a dozen colonial economies. All of it depended on the Royal Navy holding those lanes open. When France entered the war and began contesting the sea at multiple points simultaneously, it did not simply complicate the British position in America. It stretched every ship, every squadron, every naval resource across a map that now had no safe edges. British admirals who might have concentrated overwhelming force off New York or the Chesapeake found themselves instead dividing their attention and their fleets across an ocean that had no front line. In the Caribbean, the consequences were immediate. France had Caribbean possessions of genuine strategic weight, and the Navy moved to extend them the moment war was declared. In September of 1778, French forces captured Dominica, catching the British garrison there unprepared. The following year, a French squadron under D'Estaing, the same admiral who had struggled off Newport, moved decisively through the Lesser Antilles and took Grenada. The British fleet under Admiral John Byron gave chase and was badly mauled in the engagement that followed. These were not peripheral operations. The Sugar Islands produced revenues that financed empires. Grenada, Dominica, St. Vincent. These names carried economic weight that reverberated in the counting houses of London as surely as any military dispatch. Britain could not ignore losses there to concentrate in America. The sugar trade was itself a strategic asset worth fighting for, and France was fighting for it aggressively, island by island. The French naval bases in the Caribbean, Martinique above all, but also Cap Français on the northern coast of Saint-Domingue, formed the logistical spine of this campaign. They were not merely ports of refuge, they were operational hubs where squadrons could refit, where transatlantic convoys could be assembled and dispersed, where the strategic threads connecting the Caribbean to the Atlantic to the North American coast could be held together by a single command structure. When de Grasse would eventually make his famous crossing to the Chesapeake in 1781, it was from these Caribbean bases that he would sail, the islands that France had spent years fortifying and defending, serving as the launch platform for the manoeuvre that would seal American independence. Every British ship tied down protecting Barbados or Jamaica was a ship not available to contest the Chesapeake. The mathematics of empire worked in France's favour, precisely because France was making them work on multiple fronts at once. But the Caribbean was only one dimension of this expanded conflict. To fully appreciate the pressure France placed on Britain, one has to follow the sea lanes east, far east, around the Cape of Good Hope and into the Indian Ocean, where a French officer of extraordinary combativeness was fighting his own version of the same war. Pierre-André de Suffren de Saint-Tropez, known to history simply as Suffren, and to his contemporaries as the Bailly de Suffren for his rank in the Knights of Malta, was not a man who fought cautiously. Where other admirals of the age maintained their line formations with rigid precision, breaking off when the tactical calculus suggested withdrawal, Suffren pressed. He attacked when others would have held, manoeuvred when others would have anchored, and understood instinctively that the purpose of a battle fleet was not to preserve itself, but to destroy the enemy's capacity to operate. These instincts would make him simultaneously the most effective French naval commander of the war, and one of the most frustrated because the captains under his command did not always share his appetite for decisive action. Suffren arrived in the Indian Ocean in 1781, commanding a squadron tasked with an almost impossible strategic brief: contest British sea control across a theatre spanning thousands of miles of open ocean, support France's Indian allies, including the forces of Hyder Ali fighting the British on the Coromandel coast, and protect French bases at Ile-de-France and Pondichéry against a Royal Navy that held significant advantages in both numbers and established infrastructure. Against Vice Admiral Edward Hughes and the British East Indies Squadron, Suffren fought 5 major engagements in less than 2 years: off Sadras, at Providian, off Cuddalore, near Trincomalee, and in the waters around the Coromandel coast. None of these battles produced a clean, decisive result. Hughes was a capable and steady commander, and Suffren's subordinates too often failed to press the attacks he ordered with the aggression he demanded. But the cumulative effect was clear. Britain could not treat the Indian Ocean as a secure rear area. Squadrons had to be maintained there, resources allocated, officers and men kept in the exhausting rotation of tropical service. Every ship in the Indian Ocean under Hughes was a ship not reinforcing the Atlantic. This was the strategic logic that connected Suffren's battles off the Coromandel coast to the siege of Yorktown, not through any direct line of command, but through the shared arithmetic of British naval overextension. Admiral Rodney, whose fleet operated in the Atlantic and Caribbean, was already pulled between protecting the Sugar Islands, resupplying Gibraltar, and watching the French squadrons based at Martinique. The Admiralty in London faced a map on which every corner demanded ships it did not have in sufficient abundance. France had not merely challenged Britain in one place, it had challenged Britain everywhere at once, and the Royal Navy, formidable as it was, could not be in every ocean simultaneously. The American Revolution, seen from this angle, was not a colonial war with a naval subplot. It was a global maritime conflict in which the struggle along the American coast was one front among several, connected to all the others by the movement of ships, the allocation of squadrons, and the strategic calculations made in Paris and London about where to concentrate and where to accept risk. Suffren knew this, de Grasse understood it. The French naval ministry, for all the inefficiencies that would hamper individual operations, grasped the essential principle that Britain's empire was a network, and that a network under pressure at enough points simultaneously begins to fail at the points that matter most. The point that mattered most, in the end, was a bay on the Virginia coast, but the path to that bay ran through the Caribbean, through the Indian Ocean, through every theatre where a French squadron kept British ships occupied and British admirals guessing. The war that most Americans remember as a struggle along the Atlantic seaboard was, in its full dimensions, a conflict that circled the globe, and France was fighting it on every circle at once. While admirals plotted global strategy and squadrons manoeuvred across hemispheres, the war also had another dimension, one conducted at closer range, more personal, more theatrical, and ultimately no less consequential for how the struggle was understood on both sides of the Atlantic. To follow that dimension, you have to follow one man, a Scottish-born captain of fierce ambition and even fiercer temper, operating out of French ports, aboard a French-furnished ship, with a crew assembled from half the nations of the world. His name was John Paul Jones, and understanding what he actually was, not merely the legend, but the operational reality, reveals something essential about the entanglement of American and French maritime power. Jones arrived in France in 1777, already carrying a reputation carefully constructed for maximum effect. He had raided British coastal shipping, embarrassed Royal Navy commanders, and cultivated connections in Paris with the same deliberate energy he brought to naval tactics. Benjamin Franklin was there to receive him, and the court of Louis XVI was not entirely indifferent to the theatrical possibilities a bold American captain might offer. But Jones needed more than an audience. He needed a ship. The Continental Navy could not simply manufacture one from ambition and goodwill. It required the French to provide it, which, in the end, is exactly what happened. On the 4th of February 1779, King Louis XVI transferred a French East Indiaman to Jones's command. The vessel had been built in 1765 under the name Duc de Duras, a merchant ship of considerable size that had spent more than a decade in the long-haul trade routes the French East India Company depended upon. Its conversion into a warship of war was financed by Jacques Donatien Le Ray de Chaumont, a French shipping magnate with deep connections to both the court and the American cause. Jones renamed the ship Bonhomme Richard, a French rendering of Poor Richard, the almanac persona of Benjamin Franklin, whose diplomatic presence in Paris had helped make the entire arrangement possible. The name itself was a piece of transatlantic symbolism, French in its language, American in its reference, speaking to an alliance in which the two were increasingly inseparable. The refit took place at Lorient, on the southern coast of Brittany, one of the great French naval arsenals. Jones did not simply receive a ship and sail away. He operated within the infrastructure of the French Navy, using its ports, its dockyards, its supply chains, its protection. When the Bonhomme Richard eventually departed on its final campaign, it did so as part of a small squadron that included French naval vessels sailing under French naval orders, their operations coordinated through the French Ministry of Marine. Jones commanded the mission, but France made it possible in every practical sense. And then there was the crew, The muster roll of the Bonhomme Richard tells a story that the legend of a single heroic American captain tends to obscure. The ship carried approximately 305 men, supplemented by roughly 15 Lascars, South Asian sailors whose presence in European naval service reflected the global reach of the maritime trade networks that fed the war on all sides. Beyond them, the rolls suggest Irish, Scottish and German sailors mixed among the Americans, along with French officers and Marines in significant numbers. The Bonhomme Richard was not an American ship in any nationally pure sense. It was a vessel of the Atlantic world, crewed by the Atlantic world, a floating argument for the multinational character of the entire conflict. The American Revolution at sea was never a story told in a single language. The battle that sealed Jones's reputation came on the 23rd of September, 1779, in the waters off Flamborough Head on the Yorkshire coast of England. The Bonhomme Richard engaged HMS Serapis, a newer, better-armed British warship, in a fight that lasted through the dark and into circumstances that made ordinary naval calculation irrelevant. The Richard was battered nearly to the point of sinking. British officers, believing the situation hopeless, called on Jones to surrender. His reply, in its most polished form at least, has echoed through American memory ever since. He had not yet begun to fight. The battle continued. The Serapis eventually struck its colours. The Bonhomme Richard, too damaged to save, sank 2 days later. Jones transferred his flag and his victory to another vessel and sailed into the Texel Roads in the Netherlands with the captured Serapis in tow. What happened next illustrates exactly why France's relationship to Jones mattered beyond the tactical. The French recognised immediately that what Jones had accomplished off Flamborough Head was not just a naval engagement, it was a propaganda instrument of the First Order. A continental captain sailing from French soil aboard a ship the French crown had provided had struck a blow against the Royal Navy within sight of the English coastline. The symbolism was almost perfectly constructed. Louis XVI awarded Jones a gold-hilted sword and conferred upon him the rank of Chevalier of France, honours that placed an American privateer-turned-naval officer within the formal ceremonial structure of the French monarchy. A medal was struck in Paris in 1779 commemorating the clash between the Bonhomme Richard and the Serapis, its imagery presenting the battle as a shared achievement of the Franco-American alliance. France was not merely a backer, it was a co-author of the narrative, and it wanted that authorship acknowledged. This matters because the war was never fought only with ships and gunpowder. It was also fought with stories. Britain understood this. The Royal Navy's reputation was itself a strategic asset, a deterrent and a recruitment tool and a source of domestic confidence. When Jones raided the port of Whitehaven on the English coast, when he carried the fight into waters where no continental captain had previously ventured, when he defeated a British warship in British home waters, he was doing something to the story Britain told about its own invulnerability. France understood that every such episode needed to be amplified, commemorated, turned into an image that could circulate in newspapers and conversation from Philadelphia to Versailles. The medal, the sword, the public honours. These were not merely generous gestures, they were investments in the alliance's narrative coherence. Jones's career from French ports also illuminated something that the cleaner national stories of the Revolution tend to gloss over: the practical impossibility of separating American naval operations from French support at this stage of the war. The Continental Navy had no base in France on its own authority. It had access to French ports because France chose to offer it, because French officials calculated that the political and military advantages outweighed the diplomatic friction with Britain. The use of Lorient, of Brest, of the anchorages along the Breton coast, these were gifts of French policy, extended and occasionally withdrawn as circumstances demanded. Jones navigated these arrangements with considerable political skill, cultivating relationships at the French court and with French naval officials that allowed him operational latitude another commander might have been denied. There is something instructive in the image of the Bonhomme Richard itself, a French-built merchant ship purchased by a French king, financed by a French magnate, refitted in a French arsenal, crewed by men from a dozen nations, named for an American philosopher's alter ego, sailing under a captain born in Scotland and commissioned by the Continental Congress. It was, in its very construction, an artifact of the alliance's complexity. Neither purely American nor purely French, it embodied the entanglement that made the war in the Atlantic something larger than either nation could have waged alone. When it went down off the Yorkshire coast, taking its contradictions with it to the bottom of the North Sea, it left behind a victory and a set of honours struck in Paris that belonged, in the most honest accounting, to both. The Bonhomme Richard's story ended in the North Sea, but the larger story it belonged to had not yet reached its conclusion. The alliance between France and the American cause had produced raids, fleet actions, a global dispersal of naval power, and still, in the spring of 1781, the war remained undecided. British forces held New York. Cornwallis was manoeuvring through the American South with a confidence that suggested he believed time was on his side, and across the Atlantic in the warm harbours of the French Caribbean, a question was taking shape that would determine everything. Whether a fleet that had spent months fighting a different war in a different ocean could be redirected in time to a place that most naval commanders would have considered beyond reasonable reach. The answer would depend on one man's willingness to stake everything on a route that logic did not obviously recommend. To understand what happened next, you have to understand where French naval power in the Western Hemisphere actually resided in 1781. It was not on the American coast. It was in the Caribbean, specifically in the rich contested waters of the French West Indies, where the sugar islands generated wealth that made the whole of the North American mainland seem, in the cold arithmetic of imperial accounting, almost secondary. The port of Cap François on the northern coast of Saint-Domingue, the city that would one day become Cap Haïtien in modern Haiti, was at that moment among the most prosperous trading ports in the Atlantic world. Its harbour was deep, its warehouses full, its strategic value immense. And in July of 1781, it was the place where the commander of the French fleet in the West Indies, Admiral François-Joseph Paul de Grasse, sat down with a Spanish commissioner named Francisco de Saavedra de Sangronis and quietly reshaped the course of the American war. De Grasse was not a man who attracted the same legends as the commanders who had come before him. He was methodical where D'Estaing had been impetuous, politically careful where others had been impulsive. He had spent the early months of 1781 doing what French admirals in the Caribbean were expected to do, protecting the sugar islands, harassing British shipping, maintaining a presence that kept the islands from falling to the Royal Navy. But a larger ambition had been forming in the correspondence that reached him from the American theatre, from Washington's headquarters and from Rochambeau's careful dispatches. The moment was there if someone could find the will to seize it. The question was whether the fleet, the timing and the resources could all be made to align. The meeting at Cap François produced a decision that was, in retrospect, almost audaciously simple in its logic and almost impossibly complex in its execution. The hurricane season was approaching. The waters of the Western Caribbean would become unnavigable for a fleet of warships by late summer, and everyone in the harbour knew it. The planned invasion of Jamaica, a prize the French and Spanish had long coveted, would have to be abandoned. That abandonment, maddening as it was to the strategists who had planned the Jamaican campaign, created something equally valuable: a window. A brief, precise period in which de Grasse's ships had no immediate task in the Caribbean and the summer winds over the Atlantic offered a path northward that would not be available again until the following year. De Grasse did not accept a modest fragment of his fleet to make the attempt. He was authorised to take all of his ships of the line northward, somewhere between 24 and 28 vessels depending on which accounts you follow, the largest concentration of French naval power yet directed at a single theatre of the North American War. To fund the operation, he solved the problem of provisioning and paying his forces with characteristic directness. He borrowed. Spanish merchants and officials at Matanzas in Cuba came forward with 1.2 million livres in specie, funds assembled rapidly under the coordination that Saavedra had helped arrange. The money was loaded, the ships were provisioned, and de Grasse made a navigational choice that a more cautious commander might never have considered. Rather than taking the open ocean route that British scouting might expect and intercept, He chose the Bahama Channel, the narrow passage between Cuba and the Bahamas, threading through waters that British warships rarely patrolled in strength. It was a longer way around in some respects. It was also a far less visible one. A fleet of 24 warships disappearing into the island passages of the Caribbean, only to re-emerge hundreds of miles up the American coast, was a fleet that had bought itself time against discovery. And in a campaign where timing was everything, time was the one resource that could not be manufactured. Before the fleet itself moved, something fast across the ocean, a frigate called the Concorde, carrying de Grasse's letter to Washington and Rochambeau. The letter detailed his intentions, his route, the number of ships he was bringing, the approximate date of his arrival in the Chesapeake. It was, in effect, an invitation to a battle that had not yet been agreed upon, sent across hundreds of miles of open water to commanders who would have to decide immediately whether to trust the message, abandon their positions in the north, and march entire armies southward before the British could understand what was happening. The Concorde raced ahead. The armies would have to move on faith that the fleet would actually appear. The fleet sailed in late July or early August of 1781, the exact date shifting slightly between accounts, as convoy departures were always subject to wind, cargo, and the thousand small delays of 18th century naval logistics. De Grasse left 4 ships of the line to maintain the approaches to the Chesapeake ahead of the main force, ensuring that British ships already in Virginia waters could not quietly consolidate before the fleet arrived. The main body moved northward through the Bahama Channel, past the low islands and the shallow reefs, into the open Atlantic. Consider what had to be true simultaneously for any of this to work. The fleet had to remain undetected long enough to arrive in force. The Concorde had to reach Washington and Rochambeau in time for armies to march hundreds of miles without alerting the British to their destination. Rochambeau's squadron under de Barras, sailing south from Newport with heavy siege artillery, had to avoid British interception on its own separate journey. The Spanish funds had to cover the provisioning without shortfalls that would cripple the fleet at sea. The hurricane season had to hold off long enough to let the crossing happen. Any one of these threads breaking would have unravelled the rest, and yet the threads were holding. By the end of August, the French fleet was entering the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay, the long blue reach of that inland sea that opened into Virginia. The summer light was still on the water. The British had not yet fully grasped what was coming. Cornwallis was at Yorktown, consolidating his position, expecting relief from the sea rather than encirclement from it. The armies were already in motion to the south. The road from the islands had been longer, stranger, and more improbable than anyone could have planned in advance. It had run through hurricane season calculations and borrowed Spanish silver, through a narrow channel between the Bahamas and Cuba, through a fast frigate's race across the Atlantic carrying a letter on which everything depended. The fleet that emerged at the end of that road was the largest single French naval force yet assembled in American waters, and it was about to close the one door that Cornwallis believed would always stay open. The fleet that entered the Chesapeake on the 30th of August 1781 had not simply sailed across open water. It had been aimed, the way a navigator aims a shot, accounting for drift and current and the invisible architecture of the wind, at a single point in space and time that would only exist for a matter of days. To understand how precisely de Grasse had calculated his approach is to understand something that gets lost in the larger drama of battles and surrenders, that the most consequential act of seamanship in the entire American war happened before a single cannon was fired. He had departed Cap Francois on the 5th of August with 28 ships of the line, 4 frigates, and roughly 3,000 French troops embarked in the transports that accompanied the squadron. The numbers alone were extraordinary. No French commander had yet assembled such a force in American waters, and moving it at speed, in secrecy, across 1,500 miles of open ocean, while maintaining the order and cohesion necessary for battle at the far end, was a challenge of a different magnitude than simply sailing north and hoping for the best. A fleet of that size requires constant communication between its elements. Signals must be read and repeated across miles of open water. Lagging vessels drag the whole column to their pace. Stragglers, in waters where British cruisers might be watching, become intelligence handed to the enemy. The route de Grasse chose addressed all of this with a kind of quiet genius. Instead of taking the conventional passage east of the Bahamas, the open ocean track that British scouting ships in the northern Caribbean routinely covered, he turned the fleet westward first, threading into the old Bahama Channel that runs along the northern coast of Cuba. This was not an obvious choice. The channel is narrow by the standards of deepwater navigation, its depths constrained by reefs and shoals that required careful piloting. It demanded Spanish pilots who knew those waters, men who came aboard at Matanzas near Havana, where the fleet paused long enough to complete the financial transaction that made the entire campaign possible. At Matanzas, the Spanish provided something more than local navigational expertise. The specie loaded there, somewhere between 1.2 and 1.5 million livres by most accounts, drawn together through the coordination that Saavedra de Sangronis had helped arrange across the Caribbean network, was the material foundation of the army that Washington and Rochambeau would soon depend on. Without pay, without provisions, armies dissolve before they fight. The stop at Matanzas was brief and purposeful, and what it produced was a fleet fully funded, freshly piloted, and pointed into a passage that British lookouts were not watching. The Bahama Channel gave de Grasse something invaluable: invisibility. A fleet moving through those confined waters, shielded by the curve of Cuba to the south and the low chain of the Bahamas to the north, was a fleet that had stepped behind a curtain. Royal Navy ships operating out of Jamaica or the northern Caribbean bases were oriented toward the open Atlantic approaches. They were not expecting a major French squadron to navigate those island passages, and their patrol patterns did not account for it. By the time the fleet emerged into the open Atlantic north of the Bahamas, de Grasse had already gained days of undetected movement. What carried him the rest of the way was wind, specifically the predictable physics of the Atlantic circulation that every experienced mariner of the era understood, but few exploited as deliberately as de Grasse did here. The steady southeast trade winds that dominate the lower latitudes pushed the fleet northward out of the channel. As the fleet gained latitude and entered the Gulf Stream, those trade winds gave way to the westerlies of the mid-Atlantic, the broad reliable airflow that bends northeast across the open ocean. The Gulf Stream itself added knots to the fleet's progress, its current a moving road beneath the hulls, pushing the ships toward the American coast faster than any log or dead reckoning could fully account for. The fleet was riding an atmospheric and oceanic system that had carried ships across these waters for centuries, but de Grasse was riding it deliberately, using it as a strategic instrument rather than simply a navigational fact. The crossing took approximately 25 days. On the 30th of August, the fleet raised the capes of the Chesapeake, Cape Henry and Cape Charles, the twin headlands that mark the entrance to that vast inland bay. The lookouts on the leading frigates would have seen the low American shoreline rising from the water in the late summer haze, the distinctive flat profile of the Virginia coast that French mariners had been observing since D'Estaing's earlier expeditions. But where earlier French arrivals had been met with complications, missed timing, and the frustration of shallow waters or absent armies, this arrival was different in every way that mattered. The British had not yet arrived. Admiral Hood, commanding the British Caribbean Squadron, had sailed north along the conventional open ocean route and had actually reached the Chesapeake before de Grasse. But finding no French ships there and concluding that the French must still be south, he had continued northward to New York to join Admiral Graves. The decision would haunt him. De Grasse arrived to find the bay open, and he moved his fleet inside immediately, anchoring in Lynnhaven Roads within the bay's lower reaches, deploying his frigates as a screen. He had chosen his position before the British could deny it to him. When Graves finally arrived with the combined British fleet 5 days later, on the 4th of September, he found de Grasse already in possession of the weather gauge and the bay's entrance. The geometry of the situation had been determined not in those 5 days but in the 25 that preceded them, in the channel threading along Cuba's coast, in the borrowed Spanish specie loaded at Matanzas, in the precise calculation of how southeast trades and Gulf Stream currents could be combined into something faster and less visible than the conventional passage north. What de Grasse had accomplished was not the work of fortune, though fortune had cooperated. It was the application of navigational knowledge, deep familiarity with Caribbean wind patterns, Atlantic current behaviour, and the seasonal rhythms that governed movement in those waters, to a strategic problem that required all three to be solved at once. The fleet had to arrive before the British could position to block it. It had to arrive with enough ships to be decisive. It had to arrive while Cornwallis was still at Yorktown, and before the autumn weather closed the operational window. Every one of those requirements was met, and each of them had been built into the route from the moment de Grasse chose the Bahama Channel over the open Atlantic. The ship sat at anchor in Lynnhaven Roads through that last night of August, 3,000 soldiers aboard the transports breathing the warm Virginia air, the officers reading the horizon for signs of British sails that had not yet appeared. The Chesapeake lay open behind them. Cornwallis was 20 miles north at Yorktown, and somewhere to the northeast, British admirals were sailing south toward an encounter that de Grasse had already positioned himself to win before they had yet sighted his masts. The improbable route had become the decisive route. What happened next would be settled on the water at the bay's entrance, but it had been decided in the passages and currents and Spanish silver of a summer crossing that nobody in London had thought to anticipate. On the morning of the 5th of September 1781, the officers aboard de Grasse's flagship spotted what they had been expecting and preparing for: the British fleet, bearing down from the northeast under Admiral Thomas Graves, 19 ships of the line pushing south along the Virginia coast, with the wind in their favour and the intention of recovering what France had just taken. What unfolded over the next several hours would later be given the formal name the Battle of the Chesapeake. It was, by the standards of the age's great sea fights, a relatively contained affair. No ships went to the bottom, no admiral fell in the smoke of a broadside, no decisive melee dissolved into the chaos of close-quarters combat that history tends to remember most vividly, and yet no battle of the entire American war mattered more. The result would decide whether Cornwallis lived to fight another season or surrendered in a Virginia field before the leaves had finished turning. De Grasse was in a complicated position when the British appeared. A significant portion of his men were ashore aboard smaller vessels deeper in the bay, participating in the landing operations that had begun in coordination with Washington and Rochambeau's approach overland. Getting the fleet out of Lynnhaven Roads quickly into battle formation, with those absent crewmen not yet returned, required the kind of rapid and practiced seamanship that the French navy of that era could in fact deliver, though not without strain. The ships came out in something less than parade order, the van pressing forward faster than the rear could follow, the whole line imperfectly formed as it emerged past Cape Henry into the open Atlantic. Graves had his own complications. The wind was shifting as the afternoon progressed, and the geometry of fleet engagements in the age of sail was as much about the wind as about the ships themselves. A commander who held the weather gauge, the upwind position, could choose when and how to close the distance. Graves held that advantage initially, but the choreography of bringing 19 ships into line against 24 requires a precision that is easier in theory than in the smoke and confusion of an actual approach. The fighting that developed was concentrated in the van, where the leading French and British ships came within range and opened with their great guns. For approximately 2 hours, cannon fire rolled across the water in the heavy September afternoon. The French van absorbed punishment and gave it back. The British ships of the leading squadron took the worst of the exchange, several sustaining serious damage to their rigging and hulls. French casualties across the fleet ran to something in the range of 220 killed and wounded, a significant toll, though the material damage to de Grasse's ships remained manageable. British losses were higher by most accounts, and at least several ships of Graves's fleet were sufficiently damaged to affect what he could do next. As the afternoon light softened into evening, the two fleets drew apart. There was no decisive pursuit, no second engagement that day. The ships drifted on the night sea, their commanders taking stock of what had been spent and what remained available. For 4 more days Graves kept his fleet in the vicinity, the two forces within sight of each other at intervals, manoeuvring without renewing the battle in earnest. Then, on the 9th of September, de Barras arrived from Newport with his squadron and the siege artillery that Rochambeau had shipped south, 8 more ships of the line joining de Grasse's already superior force, along with the heavy guns that would determine the character of the campaign ashore. The arithmetic was now impossible for Graves. He could not fight a combined French fleet and win. He could not run the entrance of the bay past de Grasse's line and reach Cornwallis. The calculation that had seemed borderline 4 days earlier had become conclusive. On the 10th of September, the British fleet turned north toward New York, abandoning the Chesapeake to French control. The bay closed behind them as completely as if a door had swung shut in the ocean. Here is the thing about the Battle of the Chesapeake that becomes clear only when you step back from the detail of ship counts and gun calibers. The French did not need to annihilate the Royal Navy to win it. De Grasse's objective was never to sink Graves's fleet. It was to remain in possession of the entrance to the bay long enough for the strategic situation ashore to become irreversible. Control of those waters, the ability to deny resupply, to deny reinforcement, to deny evacuation was the prize, and it required not destruction of the enemy but displacement. Graves had to be convinced, by damage and by numbers, that he could not break through. The French accomplished that without needing to pursue him into the open Atlantic. This is a quality of naval power that tends to get overshadowed by the drama of sinkings and captures, but it was understood very well by the admirals and strategists of the 18th century. A fleet that controls a body of water controls everything that depends on access to it. Cornwallis at Yorktown depended on the sea for everything he could not grow or manufacture in that narrow peninsula: ammunition, food, fresh troops, the possibility of escape if the army ashore became untenable. When Graves turned north and de Grasse held the bay's entrance, all of that dependence became vulnerability. The Royal Navy, which had sustained British armies in North America for 6 years, had been pushed out of the one body of water where its absence was fatal. Washington and Rochambeau's combined force arrived at Williamsburg on the 28th of September, moving overland from their extraordinary coordinated march south. They found the approach to Yorktown open, the water approaches secured, the French siege artillery beginning its journey from the transports in the bay to the earthworks, taking shape around Cornwallis's position. Cornwallis waited for relief that the arithmetic of the Chesapeake had made impossible. He sent dispatches north. He watched the horizon for British sails that did not come. He tightened his lines and waited, and still the sails did not come, because the French fleet was anchored across the entrance to the bay, like a breakwater of oak and iron and 24 sets of loaded cannon. The surrender came on the 19th of October. Cornwallis himself did not appear on the field, sending a subordinate in his place, a gesture that has been read ever since as the acknowledgement that the defeat was too complete, too final for its architect to face directly. The British army marched out between the French and American lines to the sound of a tune that some accounts record as "The World Turned Upside Down," a detail that historians debate but that captures something true regardless of its literal accuracy. What had turned the world was not the siege itself, not the earthworks or the parallel trenches or the reduction of redoubts in the Virginia darkness. It was the afternoon of the 5th of September, when two fleets met in the Atlantic swells off Cape Henry, fought for 2 hours without destroying each other, and then separated, one turning south to hold a bay, the other turning north to report that the entrance could not be forced. The whole of the American Revolution's outcome, every treaty negotiation and political settlement and boundary that followed, balanced on that hinge. It was a naval battle that decided a land campaign, a water victory that secured a continent, and when Graves's ships disappeared over the northern horizon, the war's result was no longer truly in question, though weeks of hard work remained before Cornwallis confirmed it. The surrender was not yet signed, but the shape of it was already visible in the cargo holds of the French transports riding at anchor in the Chesapeake. Even as de Grasse's fleet held the bay's entrance and Graves's ships shrank toward the northern horizon, a different kind of operation had been underway, slower than a sea battle, less dramatic in any single moment, but in its totality just as decisive. The Comte de Barras had sailed from Newport on the 25th of August, threading carefully past British patrol routes, carrying something that would matter as much as any cannon fired in the waters off Cape Henry. His ships held a siege train, heavy artillery, prefabricated equipment, engineering stores, and the tools of methodical, systematic destruction. When he joined de Grasse on the 9th of September, bringing 8 more ships of the line and sealing the arithmetic against Graves, He also delivered the material means by which Yorktown could actually be taken. This is the part of the Yorktown story that tends to dissolve into abstraction when it should be rendered in iron and timber and the smell of rope and salt water. A siege in the 18th century was not simply a matter of surrounding an enemy and waiting. It was an engineering enterprise requiring specialised equipment that could not be improvised from local materials, cannon of a calibre that civilian wagons could not easily haul overland from New England or Philadelphia, and officers trained in the precise technical science of reducing fortifications, men who knew how to calculate angles, lay trenches at the correct distance, and bring guns into positions where they could do systematic damage to earthworks, rather than simply make noise in the general direction of the enemy. France had prepared all of this in advance. The siege train had been assembled and loaded before de Barras left Newport. The equipment matched to the task of attacking a fortified coastal position. Pontoon bridge sections, the prefabricated kind designed to be broken down, shipped and reassembled rapidly, were stowed in the holds alongside the artillery components, the powder, the entrenching tools, and the technical stores that Rochambeau's engineers would need. The French had not simply sent a fleet and an army to Virginia. They had sent a capability. The transports reached the head of Elk, the northern terminus of navigable Chesapeake water, on the 26th of September. From there the guns and engineers moved south by water toward Yorktown, arriving as Washington commanded his assembled force, roughly 7,800 French troops, 8,000 Continentals, and 3,000 militia, and prepared to begin operations. The speed with which that army could act was not accidental. It was the product of logistics that had been planned months earlier, shipped across the Atlantic and then down the coast, and now delivered to the exact point where they were needed. Within 2 days of the army's arrival at Williamsburg, the pontoon bridges were going up. Yorktown sat on a peninsula bounded by the York River to the north, and by marshland and creek systems that made direct approaches across open ground difficult for an army moving with artillery. Those marshes would have slowed a less prepared force, perhaps fatally, turning what should have been a swift envelopment into a grinding approach that gave Cornwallis time and opportunity. The French pontoon sections solved that problem with the kind of quiet engineering competence that rarely appears in historical memory, but that determined outcomes on the ground. Work parties assembled the bridges across the difficult terrain on the 28th of September, and the army crossed. The marshes that might have been an obstacle became irrelevant. The timeline held. Rochambeau's role in all of this was the role of a man who had been thinking about exactly this problem for months. On the 17th of September, before the march from Williamsburg to Yorktown began in earnest, he had gone aboard de Grasse's flagship, the Ville de Paris, the largest warship in the world at that moment, a 104-gun ship that dwarfed anything in the British fleet and served as an appropriate setting for the coordination of what was about to happen. Washington was there. Lafayette was there. The 3 men and their staffs worked through the logistics of the final approach. How long de Grasse could commit his fleet to remaining in the Chesapeake. How the naval support would integrate with the overland movement when the siege artillery would be in position, what the timetable for opening parallel trenches required in terms of engineering resources. This was not a council of war in the dramatic sense of commanders debating strategy. It was a logistics meeting, a coordination of moving parts across land and water, and it produced the sequencing that allowed the army to appear before Yorktown, already equipped to reduce it. The French engineers who led the actual siege work were men of considerable technical education. Colonel Desandrouin and Lieutenant Colonel Kerenay organised the parallel trenches, the step-by-step approach to an 18th century fortification, each trench pushed forward closer to the enemy's walls under cover of darkness and fieldwork, each position consolidating the ground gained before the next advance. The siege guns, positioned in the batteries as the parallels advanced, began their systematic work. By early October, the bombardment was continuous enough to make Cornwallis's position untenable. The guns that were doing this damage had crossed the Atlantic in French holds, been transferred at Newport to de Barras's squadron, carried down the coast under threat of interception, unloaded at the head of Elk, moved south by water, brought ashore and assembled by men who had been specifically trained for exactly this purpose. When the British redoubts were stormed in the darkness of the 14th of October, the French taking Redoubt 9, the Americans under Hamilton taking Redoubt 10 in a night assault that has received considerably more historical attention, the assault was only possible because the siege lines had been brought close enough by systematic, methodical engineering work. The drama of the nighttime storming tends to overshadow the weeks of spade work that made it feasible. But the men with shovels and pontoon timbers had made the men with bayonets possible. Cornwallis opened negotiations on the 17th. The formal surrender came on the 19th of October, 1781. There is a temptation, when telling the story of Yorktown, to locate the decisive moment in one of its more photogenic episodes. The naval battle off Cape Henry, the night assault on the redoubts, the march of the British Army between the French and American lines. All of those moments carry genuine weight, but the campaign's outcome rested on something less visible: the capacity of a naval power to move not just fighting ships, but the tools of land warfare across thousands of miles of water, and deliver them to the right place at the right time in functioning condition. De Grasse's battle closed the bay. De Barras's cargo filled it with the means to finish the job. The siege train that left French ports months before the campaign began crossed the Atlantic, sat in the hold of a squadron that navigated past British patrols, changed hands in Newport, rode south through waters controlled by a fleet that had just won the most important naval battle of the war, and was then assembled in Virginia by engineers who had studied fortification reduction in French military academies. That train of iron and oak and cordage is what put Cornwallis in the position of sending a subordinate to hold his sword, because his own hands, perhaps, could not bear the weight of what had been lost. The surrender at Yorktown drew the lines of history cleanly, the kind of ending that lends itself to monuments and anniversaries, and the reassuring sense that decisive events announce themselves with appropriate ceremony. But wars do not confine themselves to their climactic episodes. Along the American coastline, in the estuaries and river mouths and contested inlets that no monument commemorates, a different kind of maritime violence had been playing out for years, smaller in scale, harder to categorize, and in many cases still only partially understood. To follow that thread, it helps to step back a few years from Yorktown, back to the autumn of 1778, when the formal alliance between France and America was still new, and the shape of the war at sea was still being negotiated in practice rather than theory. The waters off New Jersey were not the Caribbean, not the Channel, not the site of any battle that earned its own name in the standard histories. But they were contested in ways that mattered to the people who sailed them. Chestnut Neck sat at the mouth of the Mullica River on the southern New Jersey coast, and by 1778 it had become something the British found intolerable: a functioning privateer port, the most significant rebel-controlled harbour between Boston and Charleston. The men operating out of Chestnut Neck held letters of marque from the Continental Congress, legal instruments that transformed what might otherwise be called piracy into something resembling authorised warfare. They used these to seize British merchant vessels, strip them of cargo, and sell the prizes through a network of buyers and brokers operating along the Jersey shore. The British knew the port existed. They had been absorbing its losses for long enough. In October of 1778 they decided to end it. 10 warships and roughly 400 Marines made their way south along the coast, and on the 6th of October they came up the Mullica River and burned Chestnut Neck. The privateer hub was destroyed. What they could not fully achieve was the capture or destruction of every vessel that had been operating out of it, and in the chaos of the raid some ships were scuttled, run aground, or simply vanished into the river and the surrounding marshland and the accumulated silt of centuries. What makes Chestnut Neck relevant to the larger story, to the French story, is the question of what exactly was flowing through that port. Contemporary accounts suggest that gunpowder, ammunition, and military supplies with French origins moved through the Mullica River system into the interior, part of the same covert supply chain that Beaumarchais and others had been threading through American ports since 1776. No surviving French ship log names the privateers operating from Chestnut Neck directly, and the connection remains inferred rather than documented in the way historians prefer. But the geography and the timing and the nature of what the privateers were doing all point toward a harbour that was, at minimum, a downstream beneficiary of French material support, and possibly something more actively linked to French naval strategy in the contested waters of the mid-Atlantic coast. That inference might have remained exactly that, an inference, a footnote in regional histories, if the Molucca River had not begun in recent years to give up evidence of its own. Underwater survey teams from Stockton University and the New Jersey Maritime Museum have located 4 18th century shipwrecks in the Molucca River, lying at depths between 14 and 40 feet in water that the river has been covering and obscuring for more than 200 years. The wrecks have been assigned working names: the Bede Wreck, the Kramer Wreck, the Field Wreck, and a 4th designated the Molucca Wreck, and their positions, their construction characteristics, and the artifacts recovered from them all point toward the period of the October 1778 battle. Archaeologists believe the 4 vessels represent ships that were scuttled or lost during or immediately after the British raid, the physical remains of the event that ended Chestnut Neck as a functioning privateer port. What the divers have recovered gives the site a texture that sonar alone cannot provide. Glass trading beads, which give the first wreck its working name, came up from the riverbed alongside beer and water bottle shards, the ordinary material culture of men living aboard working vessels, the kind of debris that accumulates in the bilges and between planks over years of use, bricks from a ship's hearth, the small cooking structure that kept crews fed on long passages, emerged from the silt in pieces. These are not the artifacts of a famous engagement. They are the remnants of a working life at sea, of men who operated in obscurity and whose names, in most cases, the historical record did not preserve. The identification of what exactly these wrecks represent is still provisional, and the researchers working on them are appropriately careful about the limits of what the current evidence supports. Sonar analysis and artifact study suggest the 4 vessels are not all the same type of ship. Some appear to be American-built schooners of the kind that would have operated out of a privateer port, but one may be a British merchant vessel, perhaps a prize that the privateers had seized and brought into the river, or a vessel caught up in the raid itself. The possibility of a 2-masted sloop among the group complicates the picture further. Mixed national crews were not unusual in this period. Men signed on where there was work and prize money, and the divisions of nationality that appear clear in diplomatic records often dissolved into more complicated arrangements at the waterline. As excavation continues and more material comes up from the riverbed, the national attribution of at least some of these vessels may shift. That provisional quality is itself historically honest. The war along the forgotten coast was provisional in exactly this sense, jurisdictionally ambiguous, nationally complicated, fought by men whose allegiances were often practical before they were ideological. A French-supplied privateer operating out of a rebel port under an American letter of marque, possibly with a crew that included British deserters, French sailors, and colonial Americans, does not fit neatly into a national narrative. The Molucca River wrecks are beginning to make the complexity visible in a way that the written record never fully captured. There is something fitting about the way this evidence resurfaces. The siege train at Yorktown was a visible and documented expression of French naval capability, its engineering logic traceable through orders and ledgers, and the correspondence of officers who left behind extensive records of what they intended and what they accomplished. The wrecks in the Molucca River represent the opposite end of that spectrum, the covert, the unrecorded, the maritime violence that happened in the margins of the war and left almost nothing behind in writing. What it left behind was timber and brick and glass, 40 feet down in a New Jersey river, waiting for the kind of patience that underwater archaeology requires. The connection between those two histories, the grand logistics of Yorktown and the obscure privateering of the Jersey shore, is the French supply network that ran beneath the surface of the formal alliance from the very beginning. Beaumarchais' gunpowder had to go somewhere. The French ammunition had to pass through ports that were not always the major ones. The Molucca River, by 1778, was part of the system that kept the continental war effort supplied, and the ships now resting in its silt were part of the machinery that made that system work. They burned, or they sank, or their crews ran them aground and disappeared into the pine barrens of southern New Jersey, and the river took them in and held them for 2.5 centuries, preserving in mud and cold water a piece of the war that the formal histories forgot to record. The river holds its wrecks in silence, but the bay holds something stranger, not timber or brick, but the shape of a memory that refuses to resolve into fact. What settles over the Chesapeake when you press far enough into the history of September 1781 is not the clean geometry of a naval engagement, with its documented positions and recorded casualties, but something older and harder to categorize: the residue of fear, transformed over generations into legend, and the question of what that transformation tells us about the war itself. When Admiral de Grasse brought his fleet into the Chesapeake in the first days of September 1781, the sheer scale of the arrival was disorienting even to the men aboard the ships that composed it. 28 ships of the line and 4 frigates, a wall of sail that, in the early morning fog of the bay, materialized as something closer to apparition than armada. The water of the Chesapeake tends toward opacity in late summer, the surface carrying a particular quality of light that blurs the line between sky and sea. Into that atmosphere came masts by the dozens, their lanterns floating in the darkness of the preceding nights as the fleet took its positions, each light disconnected from the hull below it, appearing to move without visible cause across the water. French sailors on those ships recorded the experience in terms that read, even at their most understated, as deeply unnerving. Contemporary journals describe what one account calls a ghostly procession. The fleet's own lanterns reflected off the fog, the ships at the edges of formation barely visible to those at its centre, the sounds carrying across water in ways that made distance impossible to gauge. These are the conditions that produce superstition in men who spend their lives at sea. The sailor's relationship with the unknown is not abstract. It is practical, urgent, shaped by the understanding that the sea does not distinguish between the deserving and the unlucky. In those conditions, with a battle that would determine the outcome of a revolution approaching in the fog, fear found the form that fear often finds among men who cannot fully see what surrounds them. What came next was a genuine tactical triumph. The British fleet under Admiral Graves, unable to break the French position, withdrawing northward after an inconclusive but strategically decisive engagement that sealed Cornwallis inside the Yorktown Peninsula. But victory, as any honest reckoning with naval history acknowledges, does not dissolve the anxiety that preceded it. The men who sailed through that fog in September 1781 carried the memory of it even after the outcome was known. And memories carried by men who return to ports, who tell stories in taverns and harbour-front houses, who grow old and pass their accounts to children and grandchildren, have a way of changing shape. By the early 19th century, the memory had changed substantially. The literary culture of the period was drawn to maritime subjects with a romantic intensity that the preceding generation, for all its lived experience of war at sea, would not quite have recognised. The sea in post-Napoleonic writing becomes something it had not quite been in the journals of sailors, a place of meaning, of elegy, of the irretrievable past made visible in weather and fog, and the sight of distant ships that may or may not be there. Into this literary atmosphere the Chesapeake entered as a natural setting for the kind of story the era preferred. The vanished fleet, the ghost armada, the ships of de Grasse returning on foggy evenings to haunt the waters where they had once decided a war. William Cowper's poem, The Colubriad, circulating in literary magazines in the years around 1806, invokes what it calls the ghost fleet of the Chesapeake, as a figure for vanished glory, for power that has passed and left only its outline behind. This is a poet working with metaphor rather than testimony, reshaping historical event into the kind of image that carries emotional weight for readers who are not there. That is what poets do, and it would be a mistake to read Cowper's lines as evidence for anything that sailors actually experienced or believed. But it is equally a mistake to dismiss them, because the fact that this image found an audience, that it resonated enough to be reprinted, circulated, absorbed into the period's literary vocabulary, tells us something real about how the French naval role in the American Revolution was being processed culturally in the decades after the war ended. The legend deepened at the local level as the century progressed. By the 1850s, newspapers in Virginia, the Virginia Gazette, the Richmond Enquirer, were running retrospective accounts of phantom ships reported on foggy evenings in the Chesapeake, figures seen by fishermen and watermen who connected them with varying degrees of specificity to the French Armada of 1781. These accounts deserve to be read with appropriate skepticism. Newspaper editors of that period were not above embellishing or outright fabricating the kind of atmospheric local history piece that sold copies on slow news days. The accounts are also retrospective by decades, shaped by the conventions of ghost story journalism rather than by anything resembling first-hand observation. What they document is not phantom ships, but the persistence of a narrative, the cultural insistence that a moment as large as de Grasse's arrival in the Chesapeake could not simply have ended, that something of it must remain visible for those who know how to look. Historians who have examined the ghost fleet tradition are generally careful to separate its layers. The genuine wartime anxiety is there, preserved in the journals of French sailors who recorded what they saw and felt in conditions that would unnerve anyone. The romanticization is there too, accumulating through the 19th century in poetry and newspaper prose until the event has been transformed into something more operatic than its original documentary record supports. Neither layer should be mistaken for the other. The sailors who described a ghostly procession were responding to real conditions. Fog, darkness, lantern light, the scale of a fleet that was itself unprecedented in American waters. The newspaper readers of the 1850s who thrilled to stories of phantom ships were responding to something else. The desire for the past to remain present, for the sacrifice and drama of the Revolutionary War to leave a visible mark on the landscape that had witnessed it. What the legend does, even in its embellished form, is preserve something true about the emotional texture of the event. The French fleet that entered the Chesapeake in September 1781 was, by any reasonable account, a staggering thing to witness, an assertion of maritime power that had travelled from the Caribbean under conditions that made its arrival seem, to those who had not known it was coming, very nearly impossible. The scale of it would have felt unreal to those who saw it. The battle it forced and the siege it enabled would change the political map of the Western world. For that moment to leave behind it a residue of wonder, to transform in collective memory into something luminous and strange is not merely understandable. It is a reasonable measure of the moment's actual weight. The ghost fleet of the Chesapeake is not historical evidence. It is historical aftermath, the form that a culture's encounter with an overwhelming event takes when the event itself has passed beyond living memory. The timber in the Mullica River and the lanterns floating in the fog of September 1781 belong to the same story, the documented and the legendary together constituting the full shape of what France brought to the waters of the American Revolution, and what those waters, in their way, have chosen to keep. The legend and the documentary record together tell us what France brought to the American Revolution. What they are slower to tell us is what the American Revolution cost France, and that accounting, when you begin to trace it through the treasury records and loan registers of the 1780s, turns out to be one of the most consequential and least celebrated stories in the history of the Atlantic world. The numbers themselves are contested, and the contestation is worth understanding before the numbers are cited. Historians working with French royal finances from the period approach the question of war costs from different angles, and their totals reflect those differences in method. Some scholars focus narrowly on naval and expeditionary outlays, the construction and outfitting of warships, the wages of sailors and marines, the provisioning of Caribbean and Atlantic squadrons, the logistics train that Rochambeau brought to Virginia. That accounting yields a figure in the range of 1 billion livres. Others extend the frame to include direct financial aid to the American cause, subsidies coordinated with Spanish allies, and the compounding interest on the enormous loans France took on to sustain its wartime borrowing. When those elements are added in, the aggregate rises to somewhere above 3 billion livres, with some estimates placing France's total war-related debt At approximately 3.3 billion livres by the time the Treaty of Paris was signed in 1783, the specific figure you encounter in any given account depends heavily on which costs its author chose to include, and the historiography has never fully resolved the question. What is not contested is the direction of the effect. The war was breathtakingly expensive, and France entered it already carrying a treasury that had little room for additional strain. To understand why this mattered, it is worth remembering the fiscal architecture of the French monarchy in the years before the war. Louis XVI's government was not simply cash poor in the way that a household might be short on funds in a difficult month. It was structurally constrained, dependent on a system of tax farming and noble exemptions that made revenue reform politically volatile, and committed to a level of court expenditure and debt service that left very little margin for large-scale military adventure. When Vergennes and his colleagues made the decision to enter the American war, they were making it against this background, gambling that naval victory and diplomatic prestige would produce strategic benefits sufficient to justify the borrowing required to achieve them. The strategy was not irrational. The weakening of British power in the Atlantic was a legitimate French interest, and the alliance ultimately achieved it. But the financial mechanism that funded the achievement was destructive in ways that would take several years to become fully visible. France borrowed heavily, over 1 billion livres in new loans across the course of the war, and the interest on those loans immediately became one of the largest line items in the royal budget. Jacques Necker, the Swiss-born Director General of Finances who served Louis XVI during the war years, attempted to manage public confidence in French credit through a policy of optimistic accounting, publishing a compte rendu in 1781 that presented the royal finances as healthier than they were. When the true scale of the debt burden became apparent to subsequent finance ministers, the options available to them were increasingly unattractive. Tax reform required the cooperation of the noble assemblies, which resisted it. Further borrowing was possible only at rates that worsened the long-term picture. Expenditure cuts ran into the same structural resistances that had always made reform difficult. The French monarchy, in the years following its greatest naval triumph, found itself in a financial trap of its own construction, one into which the American war had pushed it several steps further than it might otherwise have gone. The triumph itself was real. De Grasse's victory in the Chesapeake, Rochambeau's siege train at Yorktown, the coordinated campaign that forced Cornwallis to surrender. These were genuine achievements, and France extracted from them exactly the diplomatic outcome Vergennes had sought. British power in the Atlantic was checked. American independence was secured and recognised. French prestige, which had suffered through the 7 Years' War and the humiliating Peace of 1763, was substantially restored. At Versailles, the news of Yorktown was received with a satisfaction that went beyond political calculation. It felt like a vindication, a demonstration that French arms and French seamanship could still shape the course of world events. The men who had sailed with de Grasse, who had endured the fog of the Chesapeake and the long passage from the Caribbean, had earned that satisfaction honestly. But prestige does not service debt, and in the years between Yorktown and 1789, the distance between France's restored reputation and its deteriorating finances grew into a chasm that would eventually swallow the monarchy entirely. The convening of the Estates General in May 1789, the event that set the French Revolution in motion, was itself a product of fiscal desperation. Louis XVI summoned the Estates General because his Treasury ministers had exhausted every other mechanism for addressing the debt crisis, and the debt crisis had been substantially deepened by the borrowing of the American war years. The causal chain is not simple or direct. Revolutions are never the product of a single cause, and the French Revolution drew on social tensions, Enlightenment ideas, harvest failures, and political grievances that had been accumulating for decades. But the fiscal dimension is real, and the American war sits squarely within it. France spent resources it did not have to secure a revolution it admired, and the spending helped create the conditions for a revolution it did not intend. The irony has a particular sharpness when you consider what France was funding. The American Revolution was, among other things, an argument about the relationship between taxation, representation, and legitimate government, an argument conducted in the language of natural rights and popular sovereignty that circulated freely across the Atlantic in the 1770s and 1780s. French officers who served in America, men like Lafayette and the younger members of the expeditionary force, returned home carrying that language with them, finding in it a vocabulary for grievances that already existed in French society. The ideas travelled alongside the debt. Both arrived home from America at roughly the same moment, and both contributed, in their different registers, to what would unfold in the summer of 1789. France helped secure one revolution while unknowingly mortgaging the stability that might have allowed it to avoid its own. The navy that had sealed Yorktown returned to ports that were, within a few years, scenes of political crisis. The ships that had carried Rochambeau's siege train across the Atlantic would eventually sail under different flags and different commands, their role in the American War becoming a memory preserved in documents and court records, rather than a living institutional tradition. The treasury that had funded the campaign would be one of the precipitating crises of a revolution that would ultimately abolish the monarchy that had authorized the war in the first place. This is the account that the numbers, however contested in their specific totals, consistently support. France paid an enormous price for the American victory, not only in livres, but in the structural damage to a fiscal system that was already fragile, damage that accumulated quietly through the 1780s until it could no longer be managed. The naval war that circled the globe and ended in the fog-bound waters of the Chesapeake left behind it not only the independence of a new nation, but the kindling for the collapse of an old regime, a consequence so large and so unexpected that it took the world by surprise even as it unfolded. And so the tide goes out, and what it leaves behind is not always what those who commanded the waves expected to find. The French Navy entered the American Revolution through a side door. Crates of gunpowder labelled as merchant goods, silver livres counted out in Havana, frigates slipping out of Brest under ambiguous orders. It revealed itself in stages, through D'Estaing's frustrated campaigns off Newport and Savannah, through Suffren's distant battles in the Indian Ocean, through the slow rotation of a global war that touched the Caribbean, the Bay of Bengal, and the cold waters off the British Isles before it found its decisive theatre in the Chesapeake Bay. What de Grasse accomplished on the 5th of September, 1781, holding that bay against a British relief fleet with 28 ships of the line, forcing Cornwallis into the siege that ended the war, was not a footnote to the American Revolution, it was its hinge. Without the French fleet, the encirclement at Yorktown could not have been completed. Without the sealed bay, Cornwallis could have been relieved or evacuated. The surrender that followed on the 19th of October was not inevitable. It was the product of an audacious naval gamble, a southern crossing from Saint-Domingue that bypassed the Bahama Channel and arrived at the Virginia Capes with precisely the force needed at precisely the moment it was needed. Yet the story has spent 2 centuries sliding toward the margins of the American founding narrative. Land campaigns are easier to visualize, commanders on horseback are easier to commemorate than admirals wrapped in cannon smoke on open water. The mythology of American independence consolidated around Lexington and Concord, Valley Forge and Trenton, around the Continental Army and its long suffering. All of it deserved, none of it wrong, but none of it complete without the ships that crossed the Atlantic and changed the strategic equation entirely. Sea power hides beneath familiar land-based myths, because the sea itself hides its history. It leaves no battlefield to walk across, no earthworks to photograph, no ground to name and mark and return to. What it does occasionally leave is wreckage. The 4 schooner hulls resting in the silt of New Jersey's Mullica River, recovered in recent years from the site of the 1778 Battle of Chestnut Neck, and provisionally linked to French-connected privateer activity along the Atlantic coast, are among the most tangible arguments for the recovery of this history. The artifacts they yielded are quiet ones: glass trade beads, fragments of beer bottles, bricks from shipboard ovens. Not the grand material of naval legend, but the residue of working ships and working men, of a maritime war conducted in river mouths and coastal inlets, as well as in the deep water engagements that found their way into official dispatches, the identification of those wrecks as French-linked remains provisional, and ongoing archaeological analysis may yet complicate the picture. But even in their uncertainty, they point towards something the documentary record confirms. The French maritime presence in this war was not confined to fleet actions. It ran through the whole coastline, through privateering and convoy raiding, and the 1,000 small engagements that never made it into the histories, but shaped the economic pressure on British supply lines nonetheless. The Ghost Fleet persists too in its way. The stories of spectral sails and phantom lights drifting through the Chesapeake, sailors' superstitions that hardened into 19th century folklore, are not history, but they are a kind of memory, a register of the felt significance of what happened in those waters in the autumn of 1781. The imagination reached for the supernatural because the actual events had a quality that strained ordinary description. An entire fleet arriving from the Caribbean in time to close a bay and end a war. Memory, when it cannot fully account for what it witnessed, sometimes reaches for the miraculous. The price that paid for that miracle continued accumulating long after the cannons were quiet. The debt France incurred, more than £1 billion in direct war costs, with total war-related obligations reaching figures that some historians place above 3 billion livres when interest and auxiliary expenses are included, did not disappear with the peace treaty. It became one of the structural pressures that made the French monarchy increasingly unable to govern, a fiscal condition that contributed directly to the crisis of 1789. The navy that had sealed Yorktown helped to unseal a dynasty. That consequence was not intended by anyone who planned the intervention, and it was not foreseen by anyone who celebrated its success. It arrived, as consequences often do, slowly and then all at once. What the tide left behind, then, is layered. It left behind the independence of a nation, secured in part by men whose names rarely appear in the histories of that nation's founding. It left behind wrecks in river mud, and legends on the water and debt registers that read like a slow-motion collapse. It left behind a reminder that the largest events in history often turn on forces that are hardest to see. The prevailing winds that shaped de Grasse's crossing, the covert shipments that kept the Continental Army in the field before any alliance existed, the naval battle fought in a bay that most people alive today could not place on a map. The Atlantic carried all of it, victory and consequence together, and it carries the record still, patient and indifferent, waiting for those willing to look beneath the surface.